know, I've played some tough venues in my life, but I've never played a stand-up lunch before, so feel free to chew loudly and rattle your forks, as John Lennon might say, you know. I'm sure you've all heard that Bernie Madoff is finally sentenced and off to jail for, I think, 150 years. Well, he's been in jail now for about 3.5 weeks, and a couple of weeks ago he received his first news from home. His brother Frank sent him a letter, and in the letter he told him that his family was doing fine, that his mother was fine, the children were fine. And then at the base of the letter he put a PS. He said, oh, by the way, your cat Whiskers, who I know you love dearly, has died. Well, Bernie took this very badly. You know, Bernie was crushed. He really loved Whiskers. And he sat down with a pen and paper and he wrote back to his brother Frank. He said, Frank, you've got to understand, in here I don't get any news. I don't really know what's going on the outside. I don't know what's going on with the family. If you've got some bad news to share with me, you have to figure out a way to break it to me more gently. Like, you know, you could have told me that the cat was up on the roof and the cat wouldn't come down. And then maybe take another 7 or 8 days and send me another note and say, you know, we've got the fire department and we have the police department and they've got the ladders up against the house and they're working with the cat and things look you know, positive. And then finally, write me a final letter and say, look, I want to break it to you gently, but Whiskers is no longer with us. Whiskers passed, but she passed peacefully in her sleep, and all is fine. So about 2 weeks passes, and Bernie gets a letter from his brother Frank, and he opens the letter, and it says, Dear Bernie, Mother's up on the roof, and she won't come down. We just have a short time to spend together today, so I'm going to give you a very accelerated version of a very, very complex story. But I don't think, at least in the United States, that anybody's done a very admirable job of telling you what the real causes of this crisis were and which leads to what the right reforms might be. And I like to think of it as a whodunit story, kind of a mystery story. And one of my favorite mystery stories is The Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. I'm sure many of you have read the book or seen the movie. But in the movie, Hercule Poirot offers that there's 2 logical explanations for the crime. And one is a very simple explanation, that some gentleman jumped aboard the train in the dark of night, robbed a porter's uniform, killed the person, and then leaped off the train. But then he has a more sinister explanation, a more complex explanation. He assembles the 12 suspects on the train and tells them that quite possibly all 12 of them that were involved in the dark of night with disguises and changing time on clocks, and each one of the 12 individually went into the train car and stabbed the gentleman to death, and all 12 of them were co-conspirators in the crime. I have sort of a similar dual explanation of what happened with this crisis. There are people out there, Alan Greenspan I think being the most outspoken, that want to tell you that there's a very simple explanation for this crisis, that this crisis was very natural, that it was part of the general business cycle, that it happens all the time, that we have ups and downs and booms and busts. He even went so far as to compare it to a 100-year flood. He said that, there's nothing you could have done to prevent it. As a matter of fact, you couldn't even have predicted it. Well, if you believe in Occam's razor, you might believe that story, that it's a simple story and it's easily explained, therefore it might be true. But I have a more sinister story to tell you, and it's a much more complex story. And in my version of things, there's criminal activity, there are co-conspirators, there are serious victims who have suffered tremendously. And it begins, obviously, with the subprime mortgage crisis, but it doesn't end there. The subprime mortgage crisis was really the tip of the iceberg. It's just what happened first because it was sort of the craziest part of the story. But it involves banks and commercial banks, mostly in the US and the UK, but internationally as well, who created absolutely worthless mortgages by going to individuals with no income, no verification of income, really no mortgage application, and creating paper that it would be generous to call it double B junk paper, packaging it up through CDOs and calling 2/3 of it AAA. And then if that weren't enough, taking the 1/3 that was now guaranteed to be junk and doing it again, and putting all that paper into a second pool and calling 2/3 of it AAA. And of course, you know, you had the advice of your commercial bank and your investment bank who you'd had a relation with for years telling you it was a great deal for you to invest, but you also had the independent rating agency telling you it was AAA. Now, I say independent, they happen to be getting paid by the issuer, not the investors. And they didn't get paid their typical $100,000 fee, they got paid tens of millions of dollars, or in aggregate, over $2 billion to call this absolute junk paper AAA. But the story didn't end with junk mortgages. We're now starting to find out that prime mortgages are also in trouble. Commercial real estate's in trouble. As a matter of fact, if you look at bank portfolios in the United States, their entire consumer lending portfolio is in trouble. They've got auto loan problems, student loan problems, their commercial loan portfolio is in trouble, and almost all their loans to the hedge fund industry and the private equity industry is a disaster. So the entire asset side of our entire banking system, at least in the States, something terribly flawed happened. And to make matters worse, when you look at the liability side of their balance sheet, they, over the last 30 years, have taken their leverage from about 6 or 7 to 1 up to 25 to 1, which ought to scare you unless you know that European banks took their leverage up to 35 to 1. So, you know, I think the type of gambling, the type of trading, the type of monopolistic behavior that these banks were exhibiting, I think it was criminal. I don't think they could have honored all their contracts. Certainly they couldn't honor all their contracts in the derivatives market. And the question is, how did they get away with it? Where were the police in this murder mystery, or in the middle of the night when they were doing this? And there's lots of police in a liberal democratic society. There's lots of checks and balances. And the first, of course, is the court system. Well, the court system in America determined back at the beginning of the 20th century that corporations were persons and had all the rights of personhood. So corporations had a right to privacy, and corporations had a right to petition their government. Corporations could lobby their government. And it might make sense when you first think about it, because there's a lot of issues that corporations want to address with their government. But the problem, of course, is the courts in America have also found that corporations only have one objective, and that is to increase profits and shareholder value. They cannot do community development, charitable development, worker improvement, etc. They could literally be sued by their own shareholders if they did anything that didn't directly increase shareholder value. And so the two don't match. You have a legal entity, and that's all it is. It's just a virtual entity, which is a piece of paper in a folder in a file drawer in the state of Delaware called a corporation. It's been set up to compete in an economic marketplace, and now it's leapt the wall and is trying to influence political decision-making of a government body. And that's the second policing unit here, which is either asleep or tainted, and that's the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress was paid literally billions of dollars in campaign donations by these very big banking institutions to stand down, to not only not pass unfavorable legislation, but to reverse legislation that protected individuals. And the reason why regulation was important is because in the U.S., these banks have depositor insurance. And so I have my money at Citibank right now. I don't think much of Citibank's management or Citibank's strategy, but I know the federal government is guaranteeing my money. That means I can't police Citibank as a fund investor, and so somebody has to. It's a government role, and they took that regulation away.